Well, good evening to everyone in England and good afternoon here from Asheville. Thank you to the Register of Chinese Herbal Medicine and Alex Jacobs for inviting me to be part of this conference. It's very exciting to be joining you all, albeit from such a distance. By way of quick introduction, my name is Julianne Nugent-Head, and I am part of the Association for Traditional Studies. My medical doctorate in Zhejiang, China, focused on the classical perspective of herb use. In the last many years of researching and writing on this topic, I was struck not by new advances or developments through history, but rather in the way that the same simple theme held through thousands of years and many famous doctors. The foundation of this herbal theory, which guided the scholars who came before us and shaped the formulas that we still use today, comes from the Neijing. Yet, the Neijing's connection to herb theory seems largely forgotten in today's modern practice of Chinese medicine. The Neijing deserves its own course of study, page by page, line by line. But today I only have a short bit of time with you. And so I want to focus on one small segment of the Neijing, 6 lines of text. And yet in only 6 lines, 34 Chinese characters, I hope that today's brief discussion will profoundly affect your understanding of the application of herbs. These 6 lines from the Neijing are words that focus on the flavor and the nature of herbs, and this is the guiding principle to apply herbs with a classical perspective. The Neijing tells us, acrid substances can disperse, can make things move. Sweet can build, can slow, can harmonize. Bitter substances can drain, can dry, can make firm. Sour can gather, can astringe. Salty can descend, can soften. Bland can permeate, benefit, or create flow. So the Neijing tells us that the substances we use as medicine have a flavor and a nature, or a qi and wei in Chinese. They are hot, warm, neutral, cool, or cold in nature, and acrid, sweet, bitter, sour, salty, or bland in flavor. By examining herbal substances, paying attention to what was experienced in the mouth and the effect and sensation in the body, the ancients began to understand how herbs affect the body. And this is what we see documented in the Neijing. What this means is that over and over again, it was found that substances that are acrid or pungent in the mouth, for example, consistently created dispersing and moving reactions in the body. And this is tangible. Eating something acrid or spicy may make us move. We may fan the mouth, our eyes may water, we may get up and become bigger with our gestures and move about. The spicy or acrid flavors will create movement in the intestines, open up a clogged sinus cavity, or even create a sweat. In the most obvious of examples, when we eat a jalapeno, we feel that spicy very noticeable in the mouth. With wasabi, its spicy and moving is in the nose. Ginger or garlic is experienced not only on the tongue, but also in the stomach. This tangible and observable effect, from a cellular level to a gross movement level of the physical body, is not esoteric. It's real and it's reliable. Today, you eat wasabi. It creates movement and dispersing, and your sinus cavities open. Tomorrow, you see wasabi, and you know it will create the same effect. So once these consistencies of flavor and their relations were noted, they could be predicted. Thus, to create clogged sinus passages, we know to turn to an acrid or a spicy substance. And the basic idea is really this simple. If we eat something very sour, the puckering, the gathering, the physical movement of our body, not just in our mouth, but in our torso, the whole body, that effect of sour is quite different than the effect of pungent. So while my example of spicy is that we become larger in movement, fanning the mouth, our eyes watering, our nose running, if we all think about eating a lemon, our body can mimic this movement. We can feel our mouth, our face, our abdomen, both on the level of the skin and cellularly, we have a gathering or a contracting reaction from the sour flavor. So while we become bigger in movement with acrid or pungent foods, we become contracted or smaller in stature with sour foods. And again, this was observed by the scholars of the time of the Neijing, and this kind of experiment or observation was repeated and predicted such that if we desire gathering or a puckering of the body, then the sour flavor would be sought for treatment. And so we can observe on a macro and a micro level that if we eat something sweet or spicy or bitter or sour, a repeatable, predictable, reliable, and tangible effect occurs. So this Neijing theory comes from experiencing the effect of flavors and seeing that despite the differences in each individual herbal substance, one can observe and predict a common reaction based on their flavor. Whether the substance is a stone or a leaf or a root or a bug, when the taste is similar, the action or the effect in the body is similar. And the Neijing tells us this. Herbs with a similar flavor, the action is similar. Herbs with dissimilar flavors, the action is dissimilar. So on this slide here, we see this common theme, seeing it true again and again, noticing it, predicting it, and then confirming it. And that led to the creation of theory that the flavor of an herb defines its function. The flavor defines the function of an herbal substance. Acrid substances create a certain reaction, a similar reaction. Therefore, if you desire that reaction, it follows you would choose a substance with the flavor that has been shown to create the effect. And so on the next slide we see, if there is wind evil internally, treat with acrid and cool substances as acrid disperses. So this theory is created and given to us, and then it is applied for treatment. Note here that on this slide of the words from the Neijing, we are not told which cool or acrid herb. The Neijing does not say if there is internal wind, use fangji or fangfeng or goteng. The Neijing gives us the theory, acrid can disperse, can make move. And then it applies that theory to treatment. With internal wind, use acrid, cool substances. But instead of this focus today, the common paradigm is much more like this slide. We see here on this slide the benefits of green tea. We have that green tea is good for weight loss, is good for cancer prevention and prevention of cardiovascular disease, treatment of cancer, and lowering of blood pressure. This is the kind of thinking that has permeated our modern culture. It has affected our practice with medicines. It's in the media. It's in the universities and the hospitals. It's a paradigm that has affected our patients so that even they are self-prescribing herbs and vitamins for these kinds of reported benefits. We hear about miracle foods like kombucha, pomegranate juice, goji berry, gotu kola, kava kava, valerian, golden seal, echinacea. Instead of using words like disperse, build, slow, dry, soften, the kind of terminology we see on this slide associated with green tea is more common. Prevent cancer, antioxidant, lower blood pressure. And the problem is that these words sound like something entirely beneficial to everyone. And it's good marketing. It's what people want to hear. This happens with Chinese medicine terms as well. Using TCM terms to describe action is no different. We say herbs stop cough or wheeze, soften the liver, tonify the lungs, tonify the qi. These words are equally dangerous if we don't focus on how or why herbs work instead of what they have been seen to do in clinical practice. If I tell you that green tea is cold and bitter, we know that a cold substance will clear heat. The Jing tells us bitter substances can dry, can drain. The mechanism of cooling and draining that may result in weight loss or prevention of cancer or any of the beneficial things that we see on this slide may also damage the stomach yang. A bitter herb could dry and damage the yin. The potential to damage yang or to dry yin is common sense if we use words like bitter and cold to describe green tea. Bitter and cold does not color our perspective to think that green tea is entirely beneficial or beneficial for everyone. But if we use words like prevent disease, lower blood pressure, we have left the paradigm of Chinese medicine and we have lost sight of the fundamental principle of treatment, that each person is treated for what's appropriate for them in that season and in that moment. We have thousands of years of successful documentation of herb application for us to reference if we but use and understand plants the way they were used and understood by our medical ancestors. But by using them in new ways, by using new language, different language than what the Jing offers, this is what results in misuse and abuse. Ma Huang was used as a diet supplement, resulting in its being banned from the United States. The misuse of mutong, fangji, it is no different. Longdan Xieganwan was taken as a daily lower blood pressure pill by patients and caused renal failure for some patients in Beijing. And in the end, the pharmacy that sold the patent medicines was sued. But these problems of our time are not the fault of the herbs or the fault of the pharmacy, but are a result of using old tools with new methods. And this has damaged the health of our patients and the reputation of Chinese medicine. Herbs were applied from the Jing forward by focusing on how the flavors of herbs affect the body and affect the qi. All of the scholars that have come before us studied the words from the Jing and put them into action with each formula they wrote. And this is why flavor theory is so beneficial for us. These 6 lines from the Jing explain herbs and elucidate the formulas we study and use today. The formula compiled into the Shanghan Lun and the Jinghui, the Piwei Lun and the Wenbing, all of them were created with this flavor and nature theory as their guide. Thus, it is not enough to memorize formula, to know the constituent herbs, the dosages, or the indications. Only by understanding why the herbs are used in the formula can we use the formula effectively. And the why is right here in these 6 lines of the Jing. So not only will this short discussion today remind us of the classical perspective of herbal medicine, but I hope it will improve our understanding of the formula and the herbs we use today. Conversely, if we don't understand the application of the words from the Jing, even with the best intentions, we may inadvertently harm our patients or lengthen their illness with our treatment. On the next side, we see a quote from the Shanghanlun. Going in the wrong direction once with herbs will lengthen the illness. Going in the wrong direction again will shorten the person's life. What is going in the wrong direction with herbs? In the Shanghanlun, Jing warns us about purging when we should have sweat the patient, gathering when we should have dispersed. Jing tells us that these mistakes lengthen the illness or shorten the lifespan. What is he talking about? He's warning against using bitter herbs to purge when we should have used acrid to disperse, using sour herbs when we should have used acrid. Today, this may look like prescribing green tea pills to prevent cancer, to lower cholesterol, or as a general good practice for the almighty antioxidant. Thus, by not focusing on the flavor of the herbs we use, the effect of the flavor of the herbs we use, we may be going in the wrong direction with our treatment without even realizing it. To illustrate the difference in application of herbal medicine from a classical medicine perspective versus the predominant paradigm today, I would like to share a short patient example to illustrate my point. The patient is a 64-year-old man from Beijing. He's a very big, strong man, and he has a forceful pulse, a wide, swollen red tongue with a thick, greasy coat. He has a history of high blood pressure and high cholesterol. The man caught a cold, and it developed into a severe cough and intense migraine headaches. The man purchased some over-the-counter cold medicines and took them for 2 weeks with no improvement. And at that point, his family believed that he must have pneumonia, and so they took him to the hospital. After a round of diagnostic tests in the hospital, the patient was told he has late-stage lung cancer that has metastasized to his brain. He was admitted to live in the hospital, and the hospital told the family that the patient may only have weeks to live. The family was devastated. The hospital felt there was nothing they could do for him as his cancer was too advanced, but they gave him morphine for his migraine pains. The morphine did not stop the pain, however, and it made the patient quite nauseous. So on top of having severe headaches and a cough, he is unable to keep food down, and he's in shock from such a sudden diagnosis. The man's family found us to consult on the case, and we referred them to Dr. Li Hongxiang in Beijing, our 92-year-old teacher. Dr. Li diagnosed the case as a raging excess that needed to be cleared and prescribed Angong Niu Huang as the treatment for this patient. Here on this next slide, I have the ingredients of Angong Niu Huang. We have Niu Huang, Yu Jin, Xi Jiao, Huang Qin, Huang Lian, Xiong Huang, Zhizi, Ju Sha, Bing Pian, Shixiang, and Zhenju. After 2 days of this pill medicine, the headache stopped. The fever dropped. Dr. Li then followed up with a raw herb formula with a similar theme, mostly cold herbs to clear heat, bitter herbs to dry and drain, and heavy herbs to sedate or to descend the qi. After taking the raw herb formula, the patient was certainly still terminally ill, but he was quite stable. And for about 3 weeks, he sat fairly comfortably in the hospital bed, talking to his wife and daughter as they visited him every day, and they began to deal with this terrible diagnosis. The hospital, being quite impressed with his situation and seeing that his health is much better than they thought, suggests that the patient begins an IV drip of Huang Qi and Dangshan. And this is something in the hospital that they suggest to all of the patients post-chemotherapy. Using their Western perspective to look at cancer, the hospital felt that it was important to boost the patient's immune system to be able to fight and combat the cancer. And since he is doing so well, they suggest that he begins this treatment. So in goes an IV drip of huangqi and dangshan extract. Within a day of this, the patient spikes a high fever. He goes into a coma. Suddenly, this patient that was sitting in bed and talking to his wife and daughter is in critical condition. The family gets him into an ambulance and rushes him to see Dr. Li, who writes another formula given through his nose. The formula is again bitter, cooling, heavy herbs, lingzeshir and zhusha, potentially toxic, herbs that we may be afraid of today. The fever subsided and the patient came to. Again, he begins to look much better. And since he's no longer in severe pain and he's not on morphine, his appetite returns and he begins to eat. Again, he spends the days sitting in his hospital bed and speaking with his daughter and his wife. About a week later, the hospital convinces the family that since the patient is doing so well, again, he should go back on huangqi and dangshan. And again, in goes the IV and the patient goes into a coma. At this point, when the family rushed the patient to Dr. Li sighed and said, "You have to choose who is your doctor. Either you are following the hospital or you are following me, but you cannot do both." The family was so confused. They didn't know who to trust because the advice from Dr. Li and the perspective of treatment was so completely different from what they were receiving from the hospital. And as the patient was living in the hospital, they felt that they should choose the hospital's method of treatment. The hospital felt that the case was a terminal case and that they had done the best that they could. The patient did not ever come out of a coma and ended up passing away after Chinese New Year. Now, while this is not likely something we see in the West, it is the norm in hospitals in China today. The blending of Western and Eastern medicine in an altruistic desire to create a better medicine has led to using herbs from a different perspective than what we're discussing from the Neijing. The perspective of using herbs for what they do in a petri dish, animal testing, or research trials, looking at chemical components or using herbs for specific disease and symptom names, it is the predominant, overwhelming paradigm of herb use in China today. And in this patient's case, it was an unfortunate result. I saw firsthand the application of herbs with the appropriate flavor and nature bring this patient back to life. And I watched the extract of 2 plants whose flavor and nature was inappropriate for the patient take that life away overnight. Now, perhaps this case example seems extreme, but it is a great example of the difference of the classical Chinese medicine perspective versus a modern and scientific perspective. One doctor applied cold, bitter, heavy, and powerful herbs to clear the heat and excess condition. In contrast, the hospital supported the immune system of the patient with herbs documented through research to benefit the immune system, which herbs happened to be sweet and warm. One treatment focused on clearing the pathogen. One treatment focused on tonifying the patient's immune. The direction of the treatments were completely opposite. Again, this may seem like an extreme example that you may never bump into, but the truth is, today, herb use in the West is heavily influenced by what's happening in China. And our application of herbs today, even when we're not treating the critically ill, is often for what a book says an herb will do, and not first and foremost for the flavor of the herb that will create the appropriate effect of our patient's qi. This may not seem like such an important distinction, but it is crucial to the efficacy and safety of Chinese herb use. Yet, flavor and nature is not the focus and foremost consideration of herb application today. And while I am the one talking to you about this, it is not my words telling us to reframe and rethink our modern application of herbs. Here on the next slide, we have a quote from the Song Dynasty. When the method should be to use acrid, sweet, but instead sour and bitter are used. Or the method is to use sour and bitter, but instead acrid and sweet are used. This is to be hazy about the use of yin and yang, and in this way, a doctor kills their patient. We may believe that we practice holistic medicine. We may tell our patients that Chinese medicine treats each individual person, that herbs are safe because they're plants, that there are less side effects, that Chinese medicine has a history of thousands of years of effective use. But herbs are only safe and herbs are only effective if they are used appropriately, if they are used with the theory that guided the thousands of years of successful application. And so I ask you on this next slide, what comes to mind when you see these herbs? Do you have key phrases like moves blood, treats wind, tonifies the spleen? Do you know without hesitation the flavor and nature of these of the most commonly used substances? In school, we memorize single herbs and formula, their actions and their indications, the channels the herbs enter, the conditions they treat. This herb treats headache. This herb tonifies the immune. This herb releases the neck. This herb is good for sleep. By and large, this is how we begin our thinking of herbs. But it's imperative to understand why, how, and when will the herbs or formula not do what we expect them to do? If an herb can treat a headache, when will it not treat a headache? When will it worsen the headache? When will an herb support the immune system? When would the very same herb support and strengthen the pathogen? What's important to understand as we hopefully leave the paradigm of focusing on actions and indications in our books today is that actions and indications are solely the documentation of favorable outcomes. I'm going to say that again. What we have in our books today is only the documentation of success. It does not mean that herbs do what is listed in the books. It is not a promise. It does not mean that Huangqi tonifies the immune system, or that Dongui builds the blood, or that Baishao softens the liver. It's not magic. It's not like in goes Dongui, up goes the blood. It's not like filling up our car with gas. Only if the flavor of the herb is the appropriate effect on our patient's qi. If the effect of the flavor of the herb we use, as laid out for us in the Neijing, is appropriate for our patient, moving, dispersing, slowing, drying, draining, permeating, softening, solidifying, warming, cooling, only if we affect the qi in the appropriate way will we treat the symptoms successfully. All this to say, if we affect the qi in the wrong way, if we gather when we should disperse, if we disperse when we should gather, if we raise when we should lower or lower when we should raise, any symptom the patient has, the whole system, the whole person, will not be benefited by our treatment, and we will not successfully treat their headache. We may use an herb like chuanqiong and move the blood in a person who needed building or gathering. This would worsen a headache. We may use an herb like dongui to build blood in a woman who is blood deficient with dryness, with heat and irritability. And we would create actually more heat and dryness by using an herb that's warm, acrid, and bitter. Thus, technically, if a book says chuanqiong treats headaches, we should say chuanqiong worsens headaches. If our book says dongui builds blood, we could technically say dongui could injure the blood. We must recognize that what we have in our books as action or indication is only the positive outcomes of proper, appropriate application of the flavor of herbs. A doctor in history who used an herb in the right situation achieved this result. That's what we have in our books. That's all it means. Actions and indications are simply historical documentation. They are possibilities, not promises. In the patient example I just presented, Huangqi and Dangshan did not tonify the immune system. They tonified his cancer. They further built and stoked the fire for a raging excess condition. And that patient ended up in a coma. But do we see in our books, Huangqi worsens cancer, precipitates coma, raises high blood pressure? Zhang Jingyue in the year 1563 tells us that the way of using herbs, there is only one Tao, and that is to know the flavor and nature. Here on the next slide we have his quote, "The way of using herbs, there is no other way. To know the flavor and nature, to recognize its yin and yang, even though the herbs used are many, can you achieve the desired results?" These 34 characters from the Neijing may seem like simple elementary theory. Maybe it seems esoteric. Acrid creates movement. Sweet creates slowing. Bitter dries. Salty softens. Maybe it doesn't seem scientific enough or real enough to stand strong as the theory of a valid medical system. But this is the foundation of how herbs are understood and applied, and effectively used to treat real life-threatening diseases. The Shanghanlun, the Jinghui, the Wenbing. These are not books talking about treating tennis elbow. These are books discussing real, serious life and death cases. And the herbs are being used and combined. The formulas are being modified by flavor and nature to treat the patient successfully and to save lives. The Shanghanlun is possibly the greatest example of the importance of this understanding. In the Shanghanlun, Zhang Zhongjing collects the great formula of antiquity, laying out when the flavor and nature of herbs are best used, as well as pointing out the misuse of herbs by doctors who used bitter when they should have used acrid, or used acrid when they should have used sour. Here is perhaps on the next slide the most famous formula of all time, guizhitang. I have color-coded the herbs in this formula to make the flavor and nature crystal clear. I've chosen red in color for warm herbs. Light blue is mildly cool. The letters in the parentheses are A to stand for acrid in flavor, SR to stand for sour in flavor, and SW to stand for sweet. And so in this slide, guizhitang, we see 2 warm and acrid herbs, 2 warm and sweet herbs, and 1 cool sour herb. We're told that this patient has a taiyang illness, that the head hurts, they have a fever, they are sweating, and the patient is afraid of wind. So guizhitang is applied for this taiyang illness. Warm, light, and acrid guizhi disperses the wind from the surface of the body. Acrid moves, and so the guizhi is warming, dispersing, and kicking out the wind, so to speak. The heavy, acrid, and warm shengjiang disperses the wind that has begun to enter more deeply into the body. Wind is a yang pathogen. Wind enters through the cracks and can blow right through the house. And so wind enters and leaves the pores open. The patient can sweat, and they're afraid of wind. Sweet herbs, dazao and gansao, slow the wind from entering more deeply into the body. Sweet herbs are sticky. They fill up the holes. They fill in the cracks. Like using putty around your windowsills, these sweet herbs slow down the wind from penetrating. But here we're told our patient has the ability to sweat. Their fluids can leak out. And wind, being a yang pathogen, can injure the yin. So we are also using warm, acrid substances that may further injure the yin. Therefore, sour and cool baishao is going to gather in and protect the yin. Thus, we are applying exactly the words of the Neijing in just 5 herbs. We're dispersing with acrid, we are slowing with sweet, and we are restraining and gathering with sour. Here on the next slide, we see guizhitang with the baishao removed. This formula, we're told the patient has a taiyang illness. After purging, the pulse is skipping and there's fullness in the chest. And so guizhitang modified by removing the baishao is the formula. This formula focuses on the yang. From the colors of this formula alone, we see our formula is all warm herbs. We can see the yang is damaged because the pulse is now skipping. The yang qi is not moving smoothly. Since cool, sour baishao benefits the yin when yang is deficient, and yang is the focus of our treatment, we wouldn't want to use a cool substance. In a situation where there's already fullness or excess gathering, lack of movement in the chest, we would not want to gather. We don't want the action of sour. Conversely, we want warm. We want to move the yang. We want to create yang qi flowing in the chest. And so the sour's action of gathering would get in the way of the dispersing action of acrid. What's important to also note here is that while only 1 herb is removed from the formula, both the flavor and nature of baishao are inappropriate. The cool herb is removed, but the sour herb is also removed. If sour flavor was appropriate but cooling was not, perhaps warm and sour wuweizi would have been substituted. If cooling was appropriate but the sour gathering action was not, perhaps the formula would have been modified with shigao or with renshen. But in this case, both cooling and gathering were not desired. Now these are just 2 formula from the Shanghanlun, but the modification of 1 herb has changed the application of the formula considerably. And the entire Shanghanlun is like this, removing or including herbs because of the proper application of flavor and nature. And actually, if one examines the formula of Li Dongyan or Zhu Danxi or Jiang Jingye, we'll see that their use of herbs is rooted in this same theory from the Neijing. Again, on this slide, acrid herbs make things move. They create dispersing. What makes one acrid substance different from the next is their unique properties, their unique differences. If it's a light acrid substance, it will create dispersing and make movement on the surface. These substances are said to raise or affect raising in the body. Guizhi, bohe, xinihua, jingjie. These substances will be said to affect the lung channel or the taiyang channel, the parts of the body that govern the skin, the pores, the chest, or the nape. These acrid substances are still affecting, dispersing, and moving, but where they disperse and make movement is here because of their lightness. And this is the yin or yang property that Jiang Jingye was talking about. We must know the flavor and nature of the herbs, and the yin and yang is this idea of the lightness or the heaviness of the herbs that later in history created channel theory. Thick acrid substances create movement and disperse, but they work more deeply in the body. They are heavier, deeper in the location of their effect. They treat cold accumulations. They warm the middle or warm the lower jiao. These are herbs like shengjiang, ganjiang, rodoko, fuzi. But when we look at acrid herbs as a whole, when we will see the words from the Neijing are true. Acrid herbs are said to course the channel, invigorate the blood, disperse wind. While herbs that are acrid in flavor may be organized in different chapters by actions in our herb books today, if you go through and gather all of the acrid substances together, you will see a common theme in their effect. They are dispersing and making movement. And thus, if we need to disperse or create movement in the body, we know we should first turn to an acrid substance. It really is that simple. The theory of the Neijing helps us understand how herbs work. And with the understanding of how, we can more accurately apply to what. So if the patient has a headache that needs to be dispersed, an excess stagnation, or a gathering of wind at the back of the nape, we would look to acrid herbs to create that dispersing. This is not the same as looking to herbs that treat headache. We are looking instead to flavor first. I want to make this tangible, more tangible, by looking at herbs from an actions perspective. Here on the next slide, we have herbs that are grouped by action. And all of these herbs are herbs that are said to clear heat. This is how they're organized in the Bensky Materia Medica. Today, our herbs are grouped together by what they do. We can see that we have herbs here that are very cold, herbs that are cold, and herbs that are neutral. And that certainly makes sense. If we are clearing heat, we would use herbs that are mostly cooling in nature. But when we look at the flavor of these herbs, Shigao is sweet and acrid. Hanshui Shi is acrid and salty. Zhimu is bitter and sweet. Zhizi is simply bitter. Danjuye is sweet and bland, while Lugun and Gujingsao are said to just be sweet. Do we need a very cold, a cold, or a neutral herb? Asking ourselves this question first is quite different than looking in a chapter of herbs to clear heat, because the way in which these herbs affect the heat is going to be quite different. Does the heat need to be dispersed? Or does yin need to be moistened? Does the heat need to be drained or purged out? Or is there clumping that needs to be softened or permeated before being able to be drained or purged? Is there dampness and fire or dryness and fire? So we have to be careful, because today our books are not categorized by flavor and nature, but instead by action. Here I have 7 herbs. They all clear heat. When we decide that our treatment strategy is to clear heat and we see these 7 choices, for example, we must be clear on why we would choose one herb over another. Now, perhaps this example is not profound enough, since all of these herbs that clear heat will likely be cool in nature. What about this example on the next slide? Here we have invigorate blood herbs. In a chapter of herbs that invigorate the blood, we have warm, slightly warm, neutral, cool, and cold herbs. We have acrid, acrid and bitter, bitter and sweet, bitter and sour, and simply bitter herbs. With the color coding that I've done here, Perhaps it seems easy to make the appropriate choice. But what about when we look in our books in black and white? When we read the symptoms that the herbs treat, it becomes quite easy to match the symptoms of our patient to a list of bullet points. I hope with this short talk today, we can all begin to think much more broadly than picking which symptom our patient has or reading the herb that seems the most appropriate. I hope with this short talk today, we can understand why would we choose a bitter herb instead of a sweet herb, a very cold herb instead of a neutral herb, the mechanism of how the herb clears heat, or how the herb invigorates the blood, by drying, draining, moistening, softening, dispersing. Which of these mechanisms are appropriate for our patient? And which of these mechanisms are inappropriate for our patient? This must be our first and foremost focus. Otherwise, we choose an herb with the appropriate action. They all invigorate blood, or they all clear heat. But really, as I've already said, what this truly means is that these herbs have in the past cleared heat, or have in the past successfully invigorated blood. But how the herb affects the qi of the patient in front of us to clear the heat, or how it will affect the qi to invigorate the blood of the patient in front of us, is crucial to safety and success. And really, it is not the same as studying the results of someone else's success. If we memorize actions or indications of single herbs and formula without the foundation of this Jing theory, we have lost the flexibility and brilliance inherent in the medicine that we practice. Again, I return to this slide. Acrid can disperse, can make things move. Sweet can build, can slow, can harmonize. Bitter can drain, can dry, can make firm. Sour can gather, can astringe. Salty can descend, can soften. Bland can permeate, can benefit. These words here are can. This is also not a promise. What herbs are you combining with others? These are possibilities of actions, and the actual effect of what's going to happen for your patient comes from every single herb, the combination of the herbs that you are using in the formula. By understanding what we have here in only 34 Chinese characters, we remove the mystery of formulations. The Jing provides us with the tools that we need to understand the brilliance of the classical formulas and the ability to write effective formula of our own. It is both simple and profound. To apply the Jing in the clinic today, we must be clear of one's treatment strategy. Do we need to disperse, make move, build, slow, harmonize, gather, astringe, drain, dry, soften, or descend? By being clear on what we wish to do in treatment, we should also become clear on what we do not wish to do in our treatment. Only with this clarity of what we want to achieve and what we must avoid can we understand the flavors that we should or should not use, and thus, which herbs we will select. With this as our starting point, we can confidently prescribe formulas for the patients we are seeing, knowing we are prescribing herbs safely and effectively.